Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Brookings. We have a quite extraordinary panel and discussion for you today. We are co-sponsoring this event with Brightline Watch, which you'll hear about in a moment. So this is a partnership between Brookings and Brightline Watch. And we are here today to ask an extraordinary question. When we think about the questions that have come up after other presidential elections, I can't remember a presidential election when a year later we were asking the question, is America's democracy threatened? That's not usually what we ask after our elections, but we are asking that after this one. And it's being discussed in 4 rather extraordinary books, which are for sale out there, right out there, for those of you interested. The first one is by our very own E.J. Dionne and Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein. Norm's next door, called One Nation After Trump. The second is by our very own William Galston. The third is by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, both of Harvard University, called How Democracies Die. And the fourth by Yascha Mounk, also at Harvard, called The People versus Democracy. All 4 of these books take on the question that we're here to talk about today, which is the state of America's democracy, and is it in fact threatened in the second year of this most extraordinary presidency that we have ever had. We're going to begin today with a presentation by Susan Stokes of a series, the latest in a series of surveys that Brightline Watch has been conducting about this very question, the state of American democracy. And Susan's going to talk to us for a couple minutes. I think you have some slides, Susan. Show us some slides. And then she'll call up the panelists, the authors, to the stage, and we'll have some discussion among ourselves and some questions for all of you. So again, thank you very much for coming. I'm Elaine Kmark. I'm a senior fellow here at Governance Studies, and I hope you enjoyed this afternoon. Susan?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Elaine. And yes, I'm Susan Stokes. I'm a professor at Yale, professor of political science at Yale, and I am a co-founding member of Brightline Watch. Brightline Watch was founded late in 2016, I should say, by myself, Gretchen Helmke of the University of Rochester, Mitch Sanders, our director of survey research, and John Kerry and Brendan Nyhan, who are political scientists at Dartmouth. I just wanted to briefly say, I'm not going to thank everybody who's made today possible and who supports our work. There are too many of you and you know who you are, but I wanted to say thank you very much to the Democracy Fund and to Hewlett Foundation, whose Madison Project initiative has been very supportive of Brightline Watch. And we are also thanking Yale's Center on International and Area Studies. Gretchen, Mitch, Brendan, John, and I started Brightline Watch, and our mission was and is to bring academic research to bear on questions of democratic resilience and erosion in the United States today. One of our key activities is to conduct surveys to gauge how Americans believe their democracy is faring. In my remarks today, I'll lay out what we've learned so far from these surveys. First, let me explain Brightline Watch's motivation for conducting surveys. We draw our organization's name from the work of Stanford political scientist Barry Weingast. Weingast is interested in how citizens can help safeguard democracy when it is threatened. He identifies 2 conditions that must hold. First, there must be wide agreement among citizens that a given principle or right is so crucial that its violation would amount to a fundamental breach of democratic governance. Second, there has to be wide agreement about when the principle has been breached. Principles that meet both of these conditions, agreement on their importance and on when they're breached are bright lines, bulwarks of democracy. We wanted to find out whether there are any bright lines in the United States today. So we undertook a series of surveys. Since there are many principles that are associated with democracy, in our surveys we ask people about a lot of them. We ask 27 questions, or we make 27 statements that are related to people's notions of what democracy is about, what it should mean. And then we ask our respondents to rank these, to rate these principles in terms of how important they see them as being to democracy, and how the U.S. is performing on these principles. I'll go into a few details in a minute, but just to anticipate our key findings. The public demonstrates quite a bit of agreement about which principles are really the crucial ones for democracy. This agreement extends even to people who are on opposite sides of partisan and other political divides. But our worry is that in a highly polarized environment, even when the public appears to agree about these important principles and agree that they're being violated, their interpretations of the nature of the violation and who or what is at fault are miles apart. So these bright lines may not be as much of a bulwark of democracy as we would hope. Brightline Watch has conducted 5 waves of expert surveys of political scientists around the countries and 3 surveys of the general public. The core of these surveys are statements of democratic principles, as I've just mentioned. To give an example, one principle is that elections are free of fraud. Another is that government protects people's rights to engage in expression, even when it's unpopular, and so on. So the format of our questions, we allow people to give answers on the question of how important principles are. They can say that they're not relevant at all, beneficial, important, or essential to a democracy. And then when we ask them about how well the U.S. is performing on these standards, they can answer the U.S. does not meet the standard, it meets it partly, it mostly meets it, or it fully meets the standard. And the figures that I'm going to show you in a minute are focused on, are adding together people who say important and essential in terms of the importance question, and who say that the U.S. is mostly or fully meeting the standard. Now, I'm focusing here on surveys of the public, and in particular, I'm drawing most of the results here from our September 2017 survey of 3,000 American adults, which represents a random sample of the larger population. And we actually have a brand new survey that we've just conducted in April this past month, and the report on that survey is actually available on the Brightline Watch website, and I'll say a couple words about what we learned from that in a minute. So we think of the divide in our country as very wide between Democrats and Republicans, and between supporters and opponents of President Trump. But as you can see here, I hope you can see, there's a good deal of agreement on both sides of the pro and anti-Trump divide. These are the percentages of people responding that a principle is important or essential to democracy. The respondents are broken down by their views of the president, with the disapprovers in blue and the approvers in red. There are some principles that Trump disapprovers place more weight on. For instance, they care more that the executive's authority be checked. They care more that there be no foreign influence in elections, and that there be no interference with the press. But on the whole, their rankings are not dissimilar from those of Trump approvers. We've been looking at people's ratings of which principles are most important and which least crucial to democracy. Now let's look at their evaluations of how well the U.S. is performing. Again, we're breaking this down by approval and disapproval of Trump. Sorry, I think I got. So unlike importance, am I on the right? Sorry, I'm ahead, aren't I? Sorry, got it. So unlike importance, evaluations of the performance of democracy vary between Trump supporters and opponents, often dramatically. When their views diverge, the Trump supporters are usually much more sanguine about American democracy. You can see that in that they rate the U.S. a lot higher than Trump disapprovers on equality of voting rights, on how well the president's powers are being limited, and on avoiding foreign influence in elections. Trump approvers and disapprovers do agree on some other principles, ones related to political violence, the need for political leaders to share common understandings of the facts, that investigations not be compromised, and that officials not gain personally from office. The principles on which the public agrees tend also to be ones that it ranks as less important for democracy. So these data, as I mentioned, are from our September 2017 survey of the public. We asked these same questions in another public survey that we've just concluded, allowing us to track changes, shifts over time from the first into the second year of the Trump presidency. So what you see here is the results of our 2018 poll are with the darker markings, and the results of the September 2017 poll in lighter markings. Let me mention that there was a poll in between in which the differences are somewhat less large. But what you can see is that the public on the whole has become more dispirited. On no principles that had the percentages saying that the U.S. fully or mostly met this standard increased between these two polls. On many of these principles, it declined. I should also mention that we have regularly been polling experts, political scientists across the country on exactly the same kind of questions, and we find that the public is more dispirited in general than our expert political scientists on the performance of American democracy. Regarding changes from September 2017 to April 2018, the public, for example, was less sure that government does not interfere with journalists or news organizations, the elected branches respect judicial independence, government agencies don't monitor, attack, or punish opponents, and several others. Now recall that a few minutes ago I mentioned Barry Weingas's criteria of bright lines that could help protect democracy. In Bright Line Watch's public surveys, do we see any possible Weingas-style bright lines? These would be principles on which there's a large gap between importance and performance assessments, when there's widespread agreement that the principle is important and that the U.S. is performing badly on it. So what you have here are responses, sort of average responses to this long series of questions. And what we're interested in here is principles that fall on the off-diagonal. So if there were a kind of real correspondence between importance and evaluation of performance, then you would expect a kind of these standards to fall on a kind of diagonal line, 45-degree upward sloping line. There, I'm showing that I'm actually a professor. And so what we're looking at are ones that sort of fall on the off-diagonal, especially down in the sort of lower right-hand portion, which corresponds to statements that people see as important, but on which the U.S. is performing especially badly. The gap is especially large for the three statements that I've circled there, and those are that there'd be no private gains from office, investigations of officials are not compromised, and there are sanctions for official misconduct. If you remember a few slides ago, these are principles on which there was not much difference between Trump approvers and disapprovers. So stepping back, we find among the U.S. public some basic principles about which there is broad agreement on their importance to democracy, and broad agreement that the U.S. is performing badly on them. That may not seem like particularly good news, but it is from the standpoint of forming bright lines on which people might act to defend democracy. But here's the less hopeful news. And it goes back to the question of a common understanding about the facts. We suspect there is a lack of agreement on on interpretations of why the U.S. is performing badly on principles like investigations not being compromised or there being sanctions for misconduct. We suspect that partisans of the two parties and Trump approvers and disapprovers probably have diametrically different diagnoses of how and why democracy is performing badly. The idea of the bright line as a bulwark to democracy is that should it be transgressed, the people would resist. They might resist directly, or they might resist through pressure on their elected representatives. But imagine, for instance, that a large portion of the public thinks that officials are escaping legal sanctions for misconduct. Everyone thinks this is bad, but they disagree about who is transgressing and getting away with it. Trump disapprovers point fingers at the president and his entourage. Trump supporters at members of the prior administration. Where then is the common motive to act? So bright lines require not just common values, but common understandings of the facts. Unfortunately, we are very far indeed from such shared understandings in America today. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.